Think about all the invisible rules, the commands that shape our day, from traffic lights to workplace guidelines. Authority is just everywhere.
It really is.
And because you're probably someone who wants to understand these, well, complex but crucial ideas without getting totally bogged down, that's exactly what we're going to unpack for you right now.
Yeah, in this deep dive, our goal is to really get to the heart of what authority truly means, explore its different angles, and sort of understand why it's such a fundamental part of our lives and, well, our societies.
Absolutely.
We'll be looking at a whole range of things, legal thinking, democratic ideals, how power actually works in practice.
Exactly. It sort of boils down to a really basic human question, doesn't it? Who has the right to tell us what to do? And maybe more importantly, why do we ever feel like we should listen?
That's the core of it.
Okay, so let's dive into the bedrock of this idea, authority.
Well, right at its core, this whole concept of authority creates a kind of natural tension with our own individual autonomy, our ability to make our own choices. Philosophical anarchists, for instance, they essentially argue that no one really has legitimate power over a truly autonomous person.
That makes me think of that old story, about Eliezer and the rabbis. They were holding firm to their interpretation, their religious law, even when there seemed to be pretty clear evidence against them.
Uh-huh.
And for Eliezer, this raised a really fundamental question. Did they really have the right to demand obedience, even when they appeared to be wrong? It's like an early example of someone really pushing back against that authority.
That's a great illustration, actually, of this tension. Now, to understand authority a bit better, we need to make a distinction. It's between de jure authority, that's the rightful claim to rule,
Okay.
and de facto authority, which is simply when people, actually accept and obey a power.
So like a newly elected president has de jure authority, the right to be there.
Exactly.
But maybe a military dictator who people only obey because they're scared, that's more de facto. They're in charge, but maybe not rightfully so.
Precisely. Think of the Supreme Soviet in the old USSR. They certainly had a lot of de facto authority. People followed their rules, generally. But whether they truly had the de jure, the rightful claim to rule, that was a whole other question.
Yeah. Right. So just because people follow doesn't automatically mean the authority is legitimate. Obedience doesn't equal legitimacy.
Exactly.
Okay, so our sources talk about something called content-independent and peremptory reasons for action CIP reasons. That sounds a bit academic. What's the simple version?
Okay, yeah, CIP reasons. Imagine a soldier getting an order. They follow it not necessarily because they agree with the content of the order, maybe they think it's a terrible strategy,
Right.
but simply because it is an order from their commanding officer. That's the essence of a CIP reason. The source of the command, the authority itself, is the primary reason for acting, not what the command actually says to do.
Ah, okay, so it's the because I said so principle, just scaled up?
Sort of, yeah.
Now, this sounds like it clashes pretty directly with the idea of being autonomous. Someone who only acts based on whether they agree with the reasons behind the action itself.
Exactly. That's the conflict. If authority demands we act for these CIP reasons just because we're told to, and an autonomous person insists on acting only for reasons they find convincing based on the content, well, how can authority ever be legitimate for someone who really values their own autonomy?
It seems like a real puzzle. How can we be both free-thinking individuals and still accept direction from authority? How have philosophers tried to square this circle?
Well, our sources point to a couple of main strategies people have tried. One way is to sort of downplay what authority can actually do.
Okay.
Some argue that even legitimate authorities don't really have the power to create obligations for us, like a moral duty to obey. Instead, they might just be authorized to use force if we don't comply.
Ah, okay. So they can maybe make us do something physically, but they can't make us feel like we ought to do it morally.
That's the idea, precisely. The other strategy goes even further, questioning whether authorities even have a genuine right to rule in the first place.
Really?
Yeah. From this perspective, pronouncements from authorities aren't really commands or threats we're obliged to follow, but they're more like expert advice, just pointing out reasons that already exist rather than creating new duties for us.
So it's like a really well-informed suggestion, maybe with some enforcement power, but not a true command. But the sources argue these attempts actually emasculate authority. Why? What does that mean?
Well, the core argument is that if authority can't actually obligate us, if it can't create a genuine duty to obey, then it kind of loses its essential character. It
Yeah.
becomes hard to explain why we even call it authority.
Yeah, what's the difference then?
Exactly. If they can't create obligations, what truly distinguishes them from just anyone offering a strong opinion or maybe making a threat, it sort of guts the concept.
That's a good point. Now, let's dig into this right to rule idea a bit more. It sounds simple, but apparently the legal scholar Hofeld pointed out that even the word right is trickier than it looks.
Yeah, Hoffeld and others helped us see that right can mean different things. Sometimes it just means you're allowed to do something, you have a privilege, and no one can demand you don't.
Like my right to walk down the street, it's a privilege, no one can stop me just for walking.
Right. But other times, a right means someone else has a specific duty towards you. That's a claim right.
Okay, so my right to walk on the pavement is a privilege. But maybe my right to not be assaulted means others have a duty not to assault me.
That's a useful distinction. Now, when we talk about legitimate authority, the argument is that it has the power to set standards of behavior that we are, in some sense, obligated to follow.
Right.
And this goes beyond just the threat of punishment. It involves what our sources call the internal point of view. This is where people within a system actually see the rules as legitimate and feel a genuine sense of obligation to follow them.
So it's the difference between seeing a speed limit as just a rule to avoid a ticket
Right.
versus seeing it as part of a system you generally accept as fair and necessary for safety, so you feel you should follow it.
Exactly. It's the difference between obeying a mugger with a gun and following a police officer directing traffic. One is pure coercion. The other implies some level of accepted legitimacy.
That makes sense. And speaking of legitimacy, our sources bring up Max Weber's point that political power can't just rely on force forever.
Absolutely. Weber's point was crucial. For political power to be stable and last, it needs to be seen as legitimate. You just can't have a system built entirely on threats all the way down, as they say.
Someone has to believe.
Someone, somewhere, whether it's administrators, soldiers, or even just a significant portion of the population, has to feel not just forced, but actually obligated to carry out the authority's will. Without that internal acceptance, the whole thing is incredibly fragile.
So a government that's constantly resorting to threats is probably on shaky ground. Okay, so we've talked about the right to rule. Now, what about this idea of theoretical authority? How does that fit in, and how does it relate to our autonomy?
Right. Theoretical authority. This is different. It's when we defer to someone, not because of their position, but because they have expertise or knowledge that we lack.
Like listening to a doctor or a scientist about their specialty.
Exactly. And our sources emphasize that relying on theoretical authority is actually perfectly compatible with being autonomous.
Okay, because in that case, my reason for listening isn't because they're in charge. It's because they probably know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
My reason is based on the content of their likely knowledge, not just their title.
Precisely. It's a content-dependent reason. You're using your own judgment to assess their expertise. But our sources also make an important distinction here. The legitimacy of legal or political authority shouldn't depend on the personal expertise of the official holding the office at that moment. The obligation to obey the law, the argument goes, should come from the legitimacy of the office or the system itself.
So I might listen to a specific government scientist because she's a brilliant expert that's theoretical authority. But I obey a traffic law passed by the legislature because it's the law, regardless of whether I think the individual legislators are experts on traffic flow.
Exactly that distinction. So how does legitimate political authority, not just expertise, actually influence our decisions?
Yeah. How does it work?
Well, the idea is that legitimate authority provides us with what are called preemptive reasons for action.
Preemptive reasons. Okay, what does that mean?
It means that when a legitimate authority issues a directive, that directive doesn't just add another reason to your calculation. It actually, in a way, replaces or excludes some of the other reasons you might have been considering.
Okay, so give me an example.
All right, imagine the law says you must wear a seatbelt. You might have reasons not to. It's uncomfortable. You're only going a short distance. You think you're a safe driver. But the law, as a preemptive reason from a legitimate authority, essentially tells you to set those other reasons aside. The fact that the law requires it is now the dominant reason.
So it's not just wear a seatbelt plus it's the law. It's more like the law says wear a seatbelt, so stop weighing the pros and cons of comfort.
That's the core idea, yes. Rational obedience to legitimate authority, then, happens when we believe, overall, that we'll actually do better at conforming to the real reasons that apply to us by following the authority's directives, rather than by trying to figure everything out and weigh all the reasons ourselves every single time.
That leads us straight to Joseph Rez's theory and this normal justification thesis. It sounds like a really key attempt to bridge that gap we talked about between authority and autonomy.
It is, definitely. Raz's approach challenges that simple idea that just acting on a preemptive reason automatically means you're not autonomous. He argues that true lack of autonomy heteronomy comes from knowingly failing to act according to the reasons you actually have, not simply from acting because an authority told you to.
Okay, hang on. So it's about whether, in the end, following the authority's command helps me do what I should have done anyway, based on the underlying reasons.
That's the essence of it. The normal justification thesis puts it like this. A directive's preemptive nature is justified if following that directive helps people better conform to the balance of reasons that already apply to them independently.
Like the speed limit example again. I obey the limit not just because it's the law, the CIP reason, but because doing so helps me achieve something I already have reason to value, like safety for myself and others, the underlying content-dependent reasons.
Exactly. The authority, when it's working properly, serves as a kind of shortcut or a mechanism to help us act in line with those underlying reasons more effectively than we might on our own. You're not blindly obeying. You're obeying because it aligns with or helps you achieve what's ultimately reasonable.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense as a justification. But our sources then explore some challenges to this idea of preemption. Is it always the case? Is it always necessary for authority to work?
That's a good question. The simple model, for instance, gets mentioned. What's its take?
Right, the simple model. It suggests that maybe we don't need this strong idea of preemption, of completely excluding other reasons.
Oh, so?
It argues we could just treat authoritative directives as very, very strong reasons. Reasons that usually outweigh others, but don't necessarily make them totally irrelevant. They think the main benefit of authority, identified by the normal justification thesis, helping us conform to reason, could still happen without strict preemption.
That feels a bit more flexible and maybe more realistic.
Perhaps. It seems to fit better with how things sometimes work in practice. Like in common law systems, judges can sometimes depart from established rules or precedents if the reasons seem strong enough. That suggests preemption isn't always absolute, even within the legal system itself.
That's true. There can be situations, maybe a law is clearly unjust or circumstances have drastically changed, where the underlying reasons become so compelling that they push back against the directive's preemptive force.
What about situations where following an authority seems to go against my own immediate self-interest? How does that fit?
That brings up the classic tension between individual reason, often interpreted as acting purely in one's self-interest and the needs of the collective or the common good. An authoritative directive might require cooperation or sacrifice that doesn't seem immediately beneficial to the individual.
Right, like paying taxes for public services I don't personally use much.
Exactly. But if we broaden our understanding of reason to include acting for the collective good, either because cooperation is valuable in itself, or because it ultimately benefits us too in the long run, then following the directive can still be seen as rational. The authority just helps coordinate or enforce that collective action.
Okay. Our sources also briefly touch on a couple of other models. The decision model and the constraint model. Can you unpack those quickly?
Sure. The decision model suggests authority works by changing our preferences, or maybe our beliefs about what others will do, which then influences our decision.
So it gets us to want to do what it says.
Kind of, but the sources point out a flaw using an example. Someone already wants to go to the gym. They don't need an authority to order them to go. The desire is already there. The order doesn't really change the decision-making process in that case.
Okay, so that model seems limited.
Yeah.
What about the constraint model?
The constraint model sees submitting to authority more like a strategy of pre-commitment. It's like we consciously choose to bind our future selves by accepting the authority's rules now to prevent us from acting impulsively or short-sightedly later.
Like setting rules for yourself, but using an external authority to enforce them.
In a way, yes. It doesn't mean you can never disobey, but it involves a sincere attempt to constrain your own future actions by accepting the authority's guidance.
Interesting. Okay, I'm getting a clear picture of the mechanics. Now, let's shift back to the value of authority. Our sources talk about how it can be instrumentally useful, helping us overcome our own limitations.
Absolutely. One major benefit is efficiency. Authorities can save us enormous amounts of time and cognitive effort. We don't have to research and deliberate every single issue ourselves. We can often rely on their directives and reasonably expect to make good choices.
Take the restaurant example you sometimes hear. You're overwhelmed by the menu, can't decide. Asking the waiter for a recommendation, trusting their authority in that limited context, is often the easiest and maybe even the best path.
Exactly. Liz's dilemma, as one source puts it. From an ex ante perspective, looking forward, before you decide relying on the waiter's recommendation, the authority, can be the optimal strategy when the cost or uncertainty of figuring it out yourself is high. You might actually end up less satisfied if you spend ages deliberating and still pick badly.
And beyond individual decisions, authority is crucial for solving coordination problems, right? Especially when we can't all talk to each other directly.
Precisely. When direct communication isn't feasible for large groups, authority can act as a central signal, a common point of reference that helps everyone coordinate their actions. Think about driving tours. We all follow the same traffic light signals, even though we haven't personally agreed with every other driver on the road. The traffic light authority coordinates us.
Schelling's example of tacit bargaining in warfare comes up too, like the unspoken agreement not to use chemical weapons.
Right. Even without a formal treaty, the shared understanding, the implicit authority of the prohibition, acted as a powerful coordination device. Each side could rationally expect the other side to also see the devastating consequences and refrain, making it rational for them to refrain too.
So the authoritative directive, whether explicit or implicit, provides strong evidence about how others are likely to behave, making it rational for us to conform as well. It helps us trust that others will play by the same rules.
Exactly. It solves the "what will they do" problem. However, our sources also caution that just assuming everyone is perfectly rational and knows everyone else is rational doesn't always guarantee obedience. There's more going on.
Why not? What's missing from that pure logic?
Well, the decision model, which kind of relies on that perfect rationality, doesn't fully capture the psychological impact of authority. Directives can sometimes actively suppress our own critical thinking and awareness of reasons not to comply.
You mean it makes us less likely to even think about disagreeing?
It can, yes, and it can also weaken our normal psychological or moral inhibitions against doing something harmful. The Milgram experiments are the classic disturbing example.
Right, where people administered what they thought were painful shocks just because an authority figure told them to.
Exactly. Many subjects intellectually knew they shouldn't continue, they expressed distress, but they felt psychologically compelled to obey the experimenter's commands. The authority figure's presence seemed to override their own judgment and moral feelings.
That's a really sobering point about the potential dark side of obedience. So if we can't just rely on calculating the rationality of each command, how do we, as rational agents, truly benefit from authorities in a stable way?
The argument is that we benefit most when we don't constantly reevaluate every single directive. Instead, we make a kind of higher-level choice to commit to the authority, to accept its directives as binding, at least within certain bounds.
So it's a choice not to constantly second-guess.
Essentially, yes, it's a commitment. And from the perspective of that prior commitment, even if a specific directive turns out to be mistaken, compliance might still be the most feasible or practical option for the individual. It wouldn't necessarily be irrational or immoral, given their initial choice to trust and commit to the authority.
This seems to lead naturally into another major concept, the service conception of authority. This flips the perspective, doesn't it? It's less about the authority's power and more about how it serves the governed.
Exactly. The service conception argues that the fundamental role, the primary function of authorities is to serve the interests of those subject to their rule. It's rooted in the Enlightenment idea that governments are instituted for the benefit of the people, not the other way around.
And the normal justification thesis we discussed fits right into this, doesn't it?
Perfectly. It sees the service provided by authority as precisely this, giving directives that help subjects better conform to the reasons that already apply to them anyway. The authority serves us by helping us act more reasonably or effectively.
Okay. And within this service conception, our sources identify two main models, the mediation model and the arbitration model. What's the key difference there?
The mediation model sees authority as a go-between, mediating between the underlying reasons and the people. It's legitimate if following its directives helps people align better with those reasons than they would on their own.
So it's about guidance towards the right action generally.
Right. The arbitration model, on the other hand, emphasizes a different core function, settling disputes and resolving conflicts fairly. This was foundational for classical liberal thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Kant. They saw the move out of a chaotic state of nature as necessary precisely to establish an impartial authority to arbitrate disagreements.
So one focuses on guidance, the other on conflict resolution. Both frame authority in terms of serving the people. Now, how does democracy fit into this picture of justifying authority? It's often held up as the most legitimate form.
Well, the argument for democratic authority often hinges on fairness and participation. When we defer to a democratically elected authority, the idea is that we're deferring to a system of power sharing that is necessary for social cooperation, empowering for citizens, and fundamentally fair because everyone gets a say.
So disobeying a democratic law isn't just disagreeing with the content. It's like unilaterally rejecting the fair process we've all agreed to.
That's the core of the argument. Choosing to disobey is seen as setting unreasonable terms for social cooperation, essentially saying, my judgment trumps the collective, fairly arrived at decision.
But our sources also rightly caution against just accepting all authority uncritically, even democratic authority. Skepticism is still important.
Absolutely. A healthy democracy requires critical engagement, but the caution is not to go too far and reject the very possibility of legitimate authority altogether.
This seems like a good point to bring in how modern philosophy, especially analytic philosophy, approaches these political concepts. It often focuses more on clarifying concepts than on making grand pronouncements about values.
Yes, that's a key shift. Analytic philosophy often emphasizes conceptual analysis, carefully examining the meaning of terms like authority, rights, democracy, equality. It pushes us to be really precise about what we mean before we start building arguments or evaluating systems.
Because even a word like equality, which sounds straightforward, turns out to be incredibly complex when you try to pin down exactly what it means in practice. You can't really study or promote equality without first defining it carefully.
Precisely. What kind of equality? The equality of opportunity, outcome, resources. Before you can even do empirical research, you need that philosophical groundwork. And this critical lens gets applied to theories of democracy, too.
Like challenging Schumpeter's view that citizens are mostly apathetic and incompetent.
Right. Critics argue that maybe that apathy isn't inherent, but a product of systems that don't offer meaningful ways to participate. Perhaps if people felt their participation mattered, they'd be more engaged and informed. It flips the causality.
And then you have the opposite critique. Like Plato's worry that democracy just lets irrational desires run wild, leading to chaos and ultimately unfreedom, hence his argument for rule by wise philosopher kings.
These contrasting views highlight how philosophical analysis forces us to examine the assumptions baked into our political ideals. What do we really mean by freedom? Are negative freedom, freedom from interference, and positive freedom, freedom to achieve potential, compatible? How do different conceptions of equality clash with liberty?
So it's about uncovering hidden tensions and clarifying our core commitments. Even if we can't find some ultimate neutral foundation for our values, we can justify them by showing how central they are to our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Exactly. It's about coherence and demonstrating the implications of our deepest beliefs. Now, beyond these moral and political evaluations, our sources also mention non-moral evaluations. What are those?
These are judgments based on what's good for an individual personally, separate from universal moral rules. Think about your personal preferences, tastes, life goals.
Like choosing a career path or deciding where to live based on what makes you happy or fulfilled.
Exactly. We make tons of choices based on these personal evaluations. The limitation, of course, is that they seem purely subjective, only relevant to the individual.
Right. But the sources suggest two ways they can gain broader relevance. One is by aggregating them, looking at what many individuals prefer. The other is by considering long-term consequences and probabilities, what's likely to lead to personal good over time.
Okay. Now let's talk about ideology. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. How do our sources break it down?
They describe ideology as operating on roughly 3 levels. There are the specific political commitments, like policies you support.
Level 1.
Then, underlying those is an evaluative framework, the core values like freedom, equality, security, tradition, that justify those policies.
Level 2, the values.
And at the deepest level, level 3, is the theoretical underpinning the fundamental vision of human nature, society, and the world that explains why those values are important and how the world works.
So the leaves, the branches, and the roots again. The specific policies depend on the values, which depend on the deeper worldview.
Precisely. And those theoretical roots are crucial. They explain and ground the values, and they provide the basis for arguing for that ideology against others. Even ideologies that claim to be purely pragmatic usually rely on some implicit background theory about how things work.
And when philosophers analyze a concept like democracy, it's not just about finding a dictionary definition, is it?
No, not at all. Conceptual analysis here is about investigating the point and significance of using that category. Why do we call certain things democratic and others not? What work is that label doing in our theories and our political arguments? What assumptions does it carry?
That helps explain why there's such a variety of definitions. Schumpeter, for example, famously offered a procedural definition, democracy, as simply an institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions, specifically, where leaders acquire power through a competitive struggle for votes.
Right, a very minimalist procedural view. Contrast that with someone like Pericles describing Athenian democracy. For him, it wasn't just about how decisions were made, but about a whole way of life. Citizen involvement, public deliberation, a certain civic character that was enabled by and inseparable from popular rule.
And because democracy generally has such positive connotations today, theorists often try to shape the definition to capture their own preferred political ideals.
Exactly, which our sources caution against. The argument is that we should argue for our political ideals on their own merits, rather than trying to win the argument by definition by smuggling our ideals into the very meaning of democracy.
So for clear analysis, maybe we need a more neutral constructional definition. What would that look like?
A key element would be effective political equality. This means more than just everyone having the same formal right to vote.
What else does it require?
It requires the actual extra procedural conditions that make that formal equality effective in practice. Things like genuinely unconstrained access to information, which implies freedom of the press, certainly, but maybe also an egalitarian educational system so people can actually process that information.
Because if one group controls all the information, or if large parts of the population lack the education to engage with it, then formal equality doesn't mean much for setting the agenda or participating meaningfully.
Precisely. Monopoly control over information is fundamentally incompatible with effective political equality. And another important point, just because you participate in a democratic process doesn't mean you personally agree with every outcome.
Right. The argument that because a decision was made by the people as a whole, it's somehow everyone's decision, is misleading. People can participate and still strongly disagree with the result.
Absolutely. Dissent is vital. Now, thinking about defining democracy structurally, one approach suggested is to focus simply on the proportion of the adult population that is enfranchised, that has political rights.
So a system is more democratic the more people get to participate, regardless of whether we think certain exclusions, like maybe age limits or historically property qualifications, are justified or not.
That's the idea. It separates the descriptive question, how many people have power, from the normative question, who should have power. Aristotle, for instance, distinguished between different kinds of rule.
Yeah.
He talked about master-slave relationships, paternal rule, like a father over children, and political rule, where those subject to power also participate in wielding it. He'd likely see Athenian democracy as political rule for the adult male citizens, but as paternal or master-slave rule for women, children, foreigners, and slaves, even if he thought those other forms were appropriate for those groups.
Interesting distinction. Okay, let's talk about decision-making within democracies. Majority rule is the common default, but what about protecting minorities?
That's the classic worry, the tyranny of the majority. While there are mechanisms like log rolling, where different minority groups can sometimes form coalitions to get what they want.
Treating votes, essentially.
Right. But we can't just simply equate political equality with whatever the majority wants at any given moment. Justice needs to be considered alongside democracy. The idea that simple majority rule is political equality is often based on an unspoken and often invalid assumption that it's the only or the fairest way to aggregate preferences.
But there are lots of other ways, right?
Absolutely. There are numerous procedures for translating individual preferences into collective outcomes, besides just a simple winner-takes-all majority vote. Think about proportional representation election systems versus first-past-the-post. PR systems are explicitly designed to give minority parties representation and influence roughly in line with their share of the vote.
So the procedure itself shapes how much influence minorities have. Now, for any of this to matter, political rights need to be effective, not just symbolic.
Exactly. A functioning political system needs real rights of rule with substantive power, not just fancy titles on paper. The concept of democracy itself, arguably, should include the effectiveness of political rights. If certain groups find their rights systematically undermined or ignored in practice, that indicates a deviation from full democracy.
Our sources also brought up that distinction between directive and non-directive constraint again. Can you remind us?
Sure, directive constraint is when someone intentionally acts to limit your options, like a government passing a law. Non-directive constraint is when your options are limited as an unintended consequence of actions or circumstances, like rising house prices, making it impossible for you to buy in a certain neighborhood, even if no one specifically intended to exclude you.
Okay. So one is purposeful restriction, the other is more like a circumstantial limitation. Now, this ties into a really big normative question. How do we weigh economic efficiency against democratic participation?
The argument presented is that economic efficiency isn't valuable in itself. Its value is instrumental. It's good because it contributes to human well-being. Therefore, the partisan economic advantage enjoyed by the wealthy shouldn't automatically outweigh the fundamental importance of economic well-being as a necessary precondition for everyone to participate effectively in democracy.
Because if you're struggling to survive economically, you don't really have the time, energy, or resources to be an engaged citizen.
Precisely. And the ability to participate in collective decision-making is seen as deeply connected to individual freedom or autonomy. If you lack that ability, you're essentially living under the directive constraint of external agencies or forces, whether governmental or economic.
Now, some liberal arguments distinguish between impersonal constraints, like lack of money, and intentional direction by an authority.
Right.
They might say only the latter truly infringes on freedom.
Right. That's a common distinction. But the counter-argument is that widespread, severe, impersonal constraints like systemic poverty or lack of opportunity due to economic structures can be just as damaging to a person's freedom and sense of self-worth as direct coercion by an authority.
And the suggestion is that maybe extending democratic decision-making with equal participation into areas currently governed by these impersonal market forces could actually enhance individual freedom, not diminish it.
That's the provocative idea. By bringing those forces under collective democratic control, we might increase the autonomy of those currently constrained by them.
Now, what about tradition? We often hear arguments for respecting established ways of doing things, the wisdom of the ages.
And there's some truth to that. Much knowledge is tacit, embedded in practices. However, the caution is that tradition can also be a carrier of irrational prejudice and unjust hierarchies.
So we shouldn't just accept things because that's how they've always been done.
Especially not in spheres where those traditions are the result of human interactions and actively harm or disadvantage certain groups. In those cases, there's a strong case for attempting sensible, rational organization and reform, even acknowledging that our attempts might be fallible.
This skepticism towards established power naturally leads us to consider philosophical anarchism again.
Right. Philosophical anarchism, in its strongest form, argues that no government, regardless of how it's structured, truly has the right to command obedience. Thinkers like Thoreau embody this.
What's the core argument?
It often comes back to moral autonomy. The argument is that a morally autonomous individual's primary obligation is always to judge the rightness or wrongness of the content of any requirement themselves. That internal moral judgment should override external factors like whether a government commanded it, or even whether they previously consented to that government's authority.
So, my consent to be governed doesn't give the government a blank check. I still have to judge each law.
According to this view, yes. The analogy of promising is used. You can only morally bind yourself through a promise to do something that is, at worst, morally indifferent. If circumstances change and fulfilling the promise would require doing something morally wrong, the obligation dissolves. Similarly, consent to government is seen as conditional.
So the conclusion isn't necessarily that government is always evil, but that our individual moral autonomy places fundamental limits on our obligation to obey it.
Exactly. Moral autonomy isn't seen as radically incompatible with political obligation, but it means that obligation is never absolute and always potentially defeasible by our own moral judgment.
This sets up the challenge for the liberal democratic synthesis, trying to mesh individual liberal rights with the majoritarian democratic rule. Our sources suggest this is inherently tricky.
It's very tricky. If you try to build a system that gives equal weight to both lock-in style natural rights, liberalism, and popular sovereignty, democracy, you run into logical tensions. For democratic procedures to be considered legitimate, their justification must rely on principles that are prior to any specific decision made democratically.
Otherwise, it's circular.
Right. Now, if those prior principles include strong liberal restrictions, like inviolable property rights or strict limits on state intervention, then those principles will inherently limit what can count as a democratically legitimate outcome. The liberal principles end up trumping the democratic ones.
And there's a practical problem, too, isn't there? If you're a consistent liberal anti-democrat wanting to limit democracy with these prior principles, who gets to interpret and enforce those limits?
Exactly. How do you ensure that the non-democratic agency doing the limiting, like a court interpreting natural rights, is infallible or more legitimate than the democratic process itself? Plus, there's simply no universal consensus on what constitutes these fundamental natural rights. Basing the limits of government legitimacy on such contested grounds seems problematic.
So, echoing Rousseau, the argument becomes, there's no democratically legitimate way to identify limits to democratic legitimacy that exists outside the democratic process itself.
That's a powerful conclusion. It suggests that if limits are to be placed, they must emerge from within the democratic discourse and agreement.
Which brings us back to justifying democracy itself. Given its near universal appeal as a value, it's surprising, as our sources note, how relatively underdeveloped the normative analyses are.
It is surprising. Schumpeter saw it instrumentally just a method, judged by its results. But compare that to Thucydides' account of Pericles praising Athenian democracy not just for its decisions, but for the whole way of life, the civic virtue it fostered. That's a much richer, more substantive justification.
So justifications need to dig deeper, connecting democracy to basic substantive values, explaining why democratic processes or outcomes are intrinsically good.
Right. Some arguments focus on the correspondence between democratic decisions and people's perceived interests, but that relies on the underlying normative claim that such correspondence is desirable.
Why should we desire it?
Theories like Rawls, drawing on Kant, offer a foundation. If you start with the Kantian conception of the person as a morally autonomous agent deserving of equal respect and dignity, that can justify principles of equality relevant to democracy. It supports maximizing individual autonomy and ensuring equal participation in the collective decisions that shape our lives.
And this idea of autonomy connects back to living a worthwhile life.
Yes. Kantian autonomy, building on Stoic ideas, emphasizes that a truly worthwhile life isn't just about achieving external goals, but about guiding one's life according to a rationally chosen substantive conception of the good. Although a critique notes that Kant's focus on the goodwill itself as the supreme value, independent of the actual good it pursues, isn't something most people intuitively accept.
What about other approaches to justifying equality and participation, maybe based on recognition?
Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic is relevant here. It highlights the deep human craving for recognition from others. While this desire can move us beyond pure self-interest, Hegel initially saw it playing out within exclusive communities of equals, like masters recognizing only other masters.
But that seems unstable.
Exactly. The argument is that recognition of one's self-worth is ultimately more secure and stable in a non-exclusive community of equals, an egalitarian society. Systems built on exclusion and repression are inherently unstable compared to more open egalitarian ones where recognition is potentially universal.
Another line of argument uses impartiality. How does that work?
The argument from impartiality suggests that only a principle of social organization based on fundamental equality of consideration for everyone could be truly impartial.
What does impartial mean here?
It's often defined procedurally. What kind of rules or principles would everyone rationally accept, knowing that these rules demand no more from them than from anyone else and give no one an unjustifiable advantage?
But doesn't that risk building the conclusion into the premises? What counts as rational or unjustifiable depends on the values people already hold.
That's the major challenge. Arguments for impartiality work best when there's already some significant overlap or complementarity in the basic values held within the community being theorized about. You need some common ground to start from.
Okay. Now, shifting gears slightly, what about the relationship between democracy and capitalism? Some argue they're fundamentally incompatible.
Yes, C.B. Macpherson is a key figure here. His argument was that capitalism, by its nature, involves a net transfer of human powers from workers to owners to generate profit, whereas the ideal of democracy aims for the equal maximization of everyone's human powers and potential. He saw these as fundamentally conflicting goals.
That leads into broader questions about power itself, beyond just formal political structures. Dahl's study of power in New Haven sparked a big debate about hidden dimensions of power.
Right. Dahl focused on observable conflicts and decision-making, but critics like Bachrach and Baratz pointed out the second face of power, the ability to keep certain issues off the political agenda altogether, preventing conflict from even emerging.
So power isn't just winning fights, it's also setting the agenda so certain fights never happen.
Exactly. And then Stephen Lukes added the third dimension, the most radical view. Power can operate by shaping people's very consciousness, their desires, and their understanding of their own interests, so they might not even perceive that their true interests are being harmed.
That sounds powerful, but also really hard to study. How do you objectively define someone's real interests if they themselves don't recognize them?
That's the major difficulty, and it opens the door to charges of imposing your own values or even epistemological relativism. It's a huge challenge for empirical research. We also need to distinguish between intentional power, A, getting B to do something B wouldn't otherwise do, and structural dominance.
What's structural dominance?
This refers to how social structures themselves can reproduce inequalities, often unintentionally. For example, residential segregation might arise not because anyone explicitly planned it that way, but because financial disparities structurally limit where people can afford to live. The outcome is inequality, but it's not necessarily the result of someone intentionally exercising power over others in that specific way.
And culture plays a role too.
Yes. Cultural forms, values, norms, ways of thinking generated by dominant groups can be partisan, reflecting their interests. When other groups are socialized into accepting these forms as natural or universal, that can be an additional layer of constraint or externality, especially if the content of that culture is biased against their own interests.
Okay, this all ties back to the meaning and value of autonomy. How we define autonomy affects where we draw the line between legitimate constraint and individual freedom.
Absolutely. Autonomy isn't one single thing. It's more like a family of related concepts. The goal is to find an interpretation that makes sense of why we value it so highly.
One sense is just not being subject to another's will. But what if someone freely chooses servitude? Does that make them autonomous?
That's a classic philosophical puzzle. It suggests simply not being ordered around isn't quite enough. Another interpretation focuses on beliefs and principles being authentically our own.
But all my beliefs are technically my beliefs, even if I got them from somewhere else uncritically. So that's not quite it either.
Right. Perhaps the key is that a valuably autonomous life requires certain conditions. Even freely chosen beliefs and actions occur within constraints. The instrumental value of autonomy seems crucial. It's the ability to shape your life according to your own critically examined values, to give priority to what you genuinely believe is important. That seems essential for living what most would consider a worthwhile life.
And the Western tradition puts a lot of weight on how we arrive at our beliefs, right? The idea of autonomous consciousness.
Yes, the idea that even correct beliefs are only truly valuable if they're grounded in our own critical reflection and understanding. Someone who accidentally holds all the right beliefs without ever thinking about them seems to be missing something important from this perspective, although, again, not everyone globally shares this specific emphasis.
Now, connecting this back to economic structures, the concentration of productive assets in market economies often leads to an employer-employee relationship where the employer essentially rents the employee's labor power.
And the argument is that the voluntary nature of the employee's consent to this arrangement is often heavily constrained by the lack of realistic alternatives. If the choice is between accepting the employer's terms or facing destitution, how voluntary is it really?
Aristotle's example of the merchant throwing cargo overboard in a storm comes to mind. It's voluntary in one sense, but heavily compelled by circumstances.
Exactly. And the crucial difference is that the storm is a natural circumstance, whereas property systems are socially constructed. Dahl, for instance, found philosophical arguments for unlimited private property rights unconvincing. Justifications usually link property to having the necessary resources for a decent life and exercising autonomy.
But if unlimited private ownership of productive assets forces many people to submit to the directive authority of employers just to survive, doesn't that create a conflict with the ideal of equal autonomy?
That's the core tension highlighted. It calls into question the common argument that employees simply voluntarily consent to relinquishing autonomy within the workplace.
This leads to proposals for economic democracy, like market socialism, as alternatives to both traditional capitalism and state-run socialism.
Right. The idea behind market socialism, often involving worker self-managed enterprises, is that it could provide greater economic independence and informational resources, potentially supporting political equality more effectively and equitably than capitalism, without resorting to state bureaucracy.
Though even then, challenges remain, like potential inequalities between different worker-managed firms.
Yes, economists like Romer have pointed that out. It suggests that even a market of self-governing enterprises might require some form of central coordination or regulation to ensure a fair dispersal of economic power necessary for genuine political equality. The big question then becomes, can that regulation itself be genuinely democratic and self-governing?
A very tricky problem. Now let's briefly touch on elite theory and structural dominance again before we wrap up.
Classical elitist theories, Pareto, Mosca, Michels, basically argue that regardless of the formal constitution, real power always resides in the hands of a small elite.
The iron law of oligarchy.
Right. And building on that, structural dominance explains how the interests of certain groups, particularly economic elites, tend to dominate the political agenda even without direct manipulation. Two key mechanisms are mentioned.
What are they?
First, structurally produced overrepresentation of certain groups in agenda-setting bodies. Think about the historical underrepresentation of women or minorities in legislatures or corporate boards. Second, structural interdependence between different parts of society, especially between the political system and the economy.
Meaning politicians have to keep the economy happy, which often means keeping the owners of capital happy.
That's the core idea. While the presence of organized labor complicates a simple picture of dominance purely by economic class, though Michael's had theories about unions becoming oligarchic too, the overall argument from structural constraint is powerful. It suggests a high probability that the interests of owners of major productive assets will be prioritized on the political agenda, almost regardless of a government's stated ideals, simply because everyone becomes habituated to conforming to perceived economic necessities.
It's a sobering perspective on the limits of political will in the face of economic structures. We've covered so much ground.
We really have. From the philosophical foundations of authority and obligation, through different models of democracy and its justification, to the complex interplay of power, ideology, autonomy, and economic structures.
It highlights the Athenian ideal of direct democracy, with its emphasis on equal voice and participation at all stages, as a fascinating, if perhaps unique, historical benchmark. Features like citizenship-based rights, selection for office by lot, short terms, accountability, they aim for a very different kind of political equality.
But even that raises the classic problem of collective action. Why should a rational individual bother participating like voting if their single contribution seems statistically insignificant?
Downs' paradox of voting. It seems irrational to invest time getting informed if your vote won't make a difference. Though others argue the cost of voting is so minimal, it might be irrational not to vote, even with low impact.
And there's the related paradox. Collective action often requires organization, but organization itself, as Michael's argued, tends to concentrate power and lead to oligarchy, even in parties or unions supposedly dedicated to democratic goals. Does representative party democracy really give citizens much control if the parties themselves become oligarchic?
It raises fundamental questions about how to design institutions that genuinely empower citizens. Some models propose disaggregating government functions into smaller, autonomous agencies, staffed by random selection with rapid turnover, trying to maximize popular control and informed input.
Lots of complex ideas and ongoing debates.
Definitely. We've journeyed from the abstract philosophy of why we obey to the nitty-gritty of democratic procedures and the hidden currents of power.
We've seen the deep tension between our desire for individual autonomy and the apparent necessity of authority for social order and coordination. We've looked at how that authority might be justified, whether through service, consent, or democratic participation.
And we've explored the challenges, the potential for power to corrupt, for structures to dominate, for ideology to shape our very understanding of our interests. So here's a final thought, something for you, our listener, to mull over. Given all these inherent complexities, these tensions between authority and autonomy, power and fairness, democracy and efficiency, what does it really mean to be a responsible, engaged citizen in the world today?
That's a question with no easy answers, but perhaps a crucial one to keep asking.
It definitely is. Thanks for making this deep dive with us today. We really hope this exploration has given you some valuable new perspectives and tools for thinking about the world around you.
Yes, and we encourage you to continue reflecting on these ideas, maybe even dig into some of the thinkers or concepts we've touched upon.
Remember, each deep dive like this is tailored for an individual learner like you, aiming to offer a shortcut to getting informed on really complex but vital topics like this multifaceted concept of authority. Until our next exploration.